You're watching KTN Prime, like I've told you on KTN News. The news comes first. We continue here with our coverage. As Kenyans contend with the harsh economic times, the country's public debt remains a focal point for the country. Kenya's debt is currently standing at 7.06 trillion Kenya shillings. To help salvage the country from further sinking in debt, the man running the National Treasury, CS Ukuriatani, seems to have something up his sleeve. Is this just but a temporary reprieve? KTN's business reporter Kip Kemboi reports on just why Treasury is betting big on the new debt relief.
Borrowing more in Kenya is becoming a concern by the day, a state that has seen the Treasury plan to legislate the debt ceiling up.
The interventions that we are going to make in supporting and sustaining our economy will be not only ordinary, but sometimes will also go beyond the ordinary measures. And that's why we are not shy from borrowing. But I've assured Kenya that we are only going to borrow concessionally, where we'll have an interest rate of 0%, we'll have an interest rate of 1%, or even 1.4%, because what choice do we have?
As of August 2020, Kenya's public debt stood at 7.06 trillion shillings. This, together with committed and disbursed debt of 1.35 trillion shillings, translate to a total public debt of 8.41 trillion shillings.
The IMF and the World Bank have stated that developing countries should not have more than 40% debt to GDP ratio. Now we are in the 60%. Now that's not very sustainable.
In pursuit of further credit facilities, Kenya has bowed to International Monetary Fund's pressure to include parastatals and county loans to the national debt, a move that went through the national debt ceiling, placing the new debt figure at 10.4 trillion shillings.
The only option we have is either raise taxes beyond normal or borrow concession to support the economy. And we've decided to have an opportunity that we borrow from the concessional window from the multilateral agencies like IMF and World Bank, so that now we are going to deal with it at a later time.
To mitigate the debt pressure, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative has been rolled out to ease the debt burden. After surpassing the first opportunity to get relief, with Treasury terming the terms of the initiative as too restrictive, Kenya will take a relief from the Paris Club, which was due between January and July 2021, saving the country 32.9 billion shillings in its debt repayment.
So I think that pressure in those, especially in the education and the health sector, have made it very, very important for these extra funds that are coming through the debt relief to be able to be plugged in.
Treasury Cabinet Secretary Ukuriatani says this will give us the fiscal space to make the much-needed spending on the COVID-19 economic recovery strategy, especially in the social, health and economic sectors.
China does not extend that debt relief, and you remember there are some elements of Chinese loans that need to be paid this month. If that money is transferred towards paying Chinese debt, then it ends up really being not really entirely useful to the country.
Kenya has also applied for debt service suspension under the G20 DSSI framework for amounts estimated at 40.6 billion shillings due from 1st of January to 30th of June 2021 from non-Paris Club bilateral creditors. With next year's budget deficit being projected to hit the trillion shilling mark, with more borrowing being expected to fill the gap, the Controller of Budget has warned of an imminent debt crisis if the trend continues. Kip Kemboi, KTN News.
So the latest bit of new information is that 32 billion shilling debt relief given to Kenya by the Paris Club creditors. We want to get more info on this to try to understand this issue much deeper, and of course the larger issue of the debt crisis in this country. We want to bring in Economist David Ndii to help us put this into perspective. Thank you, Dr. for joining us on KTN Prime tonight. Now, a lot has been happening over the last few months. Too many balls in the air, really. The debt in this country is rising. There has been the COVID-19 global pandemic. From where you sit, how would you describe the state of the country's fiscal and monetary situation right now?
Thank you very much. The country has been moving towards this sort of debt distress for several years. You're probably aware that I have voiced these concerns for the last 7 years, actually. I think the first time I raised this was in 2014, early 2014, when the government started borrowing very heavily from China and from the markets to finance infrastructure. So where are we now? As of now, I think let's use the current budget to just see what the fiscal situation is. Over the first 5 months of the fiscal year, July to November, I think the tax, we have raised about 530 billion shillings in tax or thereabouts, about 110 billion shillings a month. The requirement for servicing interest and the national government wage is about 90 billion. So after you've paid national government salaries and interest, you have 20 billion left. Counties need about 30 billion a month, or at least 25. And the national government has a budget for operation and maintenance, sort of recurrent budget of about 60 billion a month. And you've got pensions, a few other things. So you need 90 billion for recurrent, but you only have 20. It's actually against, you're not allowed by law to borrow for recurrent, although this government has now done it for a couple of years. But obviously you cannot survive if you between counties and national government on 20 billion when you need 90. But as soon as you start financing that with debt, what you are effectively doing is actually financing interest. In fiscal accounting, we would see that borrowing as actually going to finance your interest payments. So you're borrowing to pay interest. And if you start borrowing to pay interest, you are on what we call an explosive debt path. Because you borrow to pay interest, and then as soon as you borrow to pay interest, what you have borrowed also earns interest. So your interest bill is going back, and you can see very quickly that that will snowball into a crisis very, very quickly. So that's the situation, and
right.
That is the situation, I think. But it's not COVID. COVID has tipped the scale a little bit in terms of the revenue side, but it was headed that way in the first place. So the situation that was going to happen regardless.
Right. You mentioned revenue there. Now, our ability to raise revenue to plug the gap given by that is vital for improving the debt situation in the country right now. Do you believe the business environment in Kenya is good enough to facilitate that?
You cannot, because part of the reason why you are in distress is because a lot of the borrowing that we are talking about, the debt, is domestic. Okay? In fact, half our debt, public debt, is domestic. But it accounts for 2/3 or more of the interest. Actually, it's almost 3/4 of the interest. And the reason that is what has done to the economy is that borrowing domestically has crowded out the private sector over the last several years. It has been put in investments which do not have a return in terms of stimulating economic performance growth. So the private sector, the tax-paying economy, the productive economy has not been growing. What we have been recording as economic growth is debt-financed public expenditure.
Right.
So we borrow money to build roads and that kind of thing. The way we account for GDP, that is accounted for as growth. So you see that during the time of Jubilee, when Jubilee came to power, when you had 5% growth, it was 80% private sector, and 20% government. Now, so 4 percentage points was private, 1 percentage point was government. Now it is 50-50. So it is government is borrowing and financing this activity, and that's what we are calling growth. And of course, public expenditure is not tax generating. So the government is in that conundrum that therefore you find that the tax revenue to GDP ratio has fallen, what you call the tax yield, from about 19%. It is now tipping below 15%.
Right.
Yeah. Yet, when Jubilee came, interest on debt was only 2% of GDP. Now it's about over 4%. So you are collecting 19% of GDP. You are paying 2% interest. So you have 17% of GDP to spend on the rest of your recurrent. Now you are only collecting 15%. You are paying interest 4%. So you only have 11% of GDP in revenue to finance recurrent expenditures excluding interest. So in a sense, you have lost about 6 or 7 percentage points of GDP in terms of revenue that you could use to finance your recurrent. So revenue is out of question.
All right. Let's talk about the latest piece of information, the relief, debt relief, 32 billion that Kenya has gotten from the Paris Club creditors. What is your view of that? Was it necessary to kick that can down the road?
This debt relief, the government sort of going into the DSSI, this debt standstill, G20 debt standstill. What the government is doing is meeting conditions of IMF, because it's negotiating an IMF bailout.
Right.
Yeah, and the sort of things you're hearing that the IMF insisted that they go. They did not want to go to that, and I'll come to shortly. The recalculation of debt, so as to also include sort of what you call consolidated public sector, including contingent liabilities and parastatals and things like that. The new tax measures that you are observing that have come into force, all those are conditions precedent to the government going back into their IMF. And I think in the report you had just a few minutes ago, there was reference to going back to concessional borrowing. Now, if you go back a little bit, what is when we went into Eurobond markets, we said we are now a middle-income country. We are what you call frontier market. We can diversify our external development finance by borrowing from the market, like the big boys, because that money comes with no strings attached, and we can do whatever we want with it, unlike money which we're borrowing from these multilateral institutions, which you have to jump all sorts of hoops to get it, and they supervise the projects and all sorts of things. So, so what you're seeing now is we became very indisciplined about that. When this government came into power, we only had one small concessional sort of commercial facility, foreign commercial facility, $600 million, which was paid off by the first Eurobond. I think when I checked recently, we now owe the London markets about $10 billion. Yeah, it accounts for about a third of our foreign debt. We also, of course, have borrowed quite liberally from China. And the money from China comes on the same terms as foreign commercial borrowing. It's actually more expensive because your bank lending, you also pay principal. So what you are seeing is that strategy has come a cropper. Mm-hmm. And we are now crawling back to the IMF and the World Bank so that we can actually more or less refinance those external debts to begin with, and possibly over time. Also, some of the domestic borrowing, we replace it with, because domestic borrowing is quite expensive. And as I said, it also crowds out the private sector. So this is basically what I have called in the past, if you read some of the things I have written, that we were going to end up in an IMF straitjacket. Right. So this is the IMF straitjacket. It is not a strategy that we have chosen for ourselves, because when you go into negotiating those that sort of debt relief, it has implications for your access to the sovereign bond markets. It has implications for your credit rating. I believe as per the terms of the Euro bonds that we have borrowed, it is actually considered a default action when you restructure your debt or negotiate for debt relief. I don't know whether that will be operationalized, but it doesn't reflect very well on the market. If you are saying you're a frontier market, you are saying you're a big boy now, you can look after yourself, and then a couple of years down the road, you go back to sort of looking for the concessional money, which is supposed to be for the poorest countries in the world. Incidentally, this DSSI, the G20 initiative, is actually supposed for the exclusively for the poorest countries in the world. So that is the club that we have now gone back to.
Dr. You're talking about what you call the IMF straitjacket. Correct me if I'm wrong, but during the Kibaki administration, we didn't see Kenya going for these kind of loans from IMF and the World Bank. What would you attribute that to now that we're coming to that?
Fiscal discipline. We actually had quite a contest early in 2003, those of us who are working on the economic strategy recovery, because there were people who thought that we should borrow and sort of mobilize more aid, and there are those of us who thought that we shouldn't. So that issue was actually not resolved. And in fact, I would say that those of us who didn't want to borrow, to mobilize a lot of our aid actually lost. But what actually happened was Anglo-leasing.
Right.
So when Anglo-leasing happened, it put a cropper to the people who are pushing for mobilizing more donor financing. I remember there was a donor meeting called at the Safari Park Hotel. I didn't attend it. I was very angry about that. I didn't like what they were doing, but it went very badly. At any rate, so I recall that is the time when Muiraria, the finance minister, in a sort of peak, said that we are not going to factor aid in the budget. Which then turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because if you're not going to factor it in the budget, then we're not quite sort of strong fiscal discipline. And I think by the third year, by about 2006, we actually ran a balanced budget on the overall. And subsequently, for a couple of years, we actually ran a couple of current surpluses. Current surplus means that you are able to finance all your recurrent budget from revenue, and then you are actually able to transfer to finance some of your development budget also from revenue. And then some of it, of course, you borrow.
All right.
So we were, I think, by the time that the Grand Coalition was leaving, the budget deficit was running around between 3% and 4%. Of GDP. When Jubilee came into power, within 2 years, in fact, I think the second year, they ramped up to 7%, and then it's been hovering between 7 and 8% of GDP. Now, if you run a budget deficit of 8% of GDP for 5-6 years, that actually means that you're spending 40 to 50% more than your income every year. Now, if you run your credit card, or if you an overdraft or whatever you're borrowing from, and you spend 30-40% more than your salary, your monthly salary,
yes, for
6-7 months, I think you will know what will happen. So it's the same thing with the country. You cannot run a budget deficit of 7-8% of GDP for 5-6 years and not expect to get into very serious trouble.
Actually, finally, on this issue of loan debt waivers, would you advise such a moratorium from China, Kenya's biggest bilateral lender?
That is not a question of whether you advise. The reason why this debt moratoria business is very tricky, because the G20 initiative, which the government has now gone into, part of what they will be trying to do is to get moratoria from other creditors on the same terms. I think they will begin with the non-Paris Club bilaterals of who are not members. I think some Arab funds and quite a few others. And then there's China, which is a very big thing.
Right.
Actually, I think as of now, probably 2/3 of our bilateral debt service goes to China. So China is a very big thing. And actually, virtually all of it is about the railway. But of course, the way China deals with its debtors is very secretive. I have not seen a situation where China has given that sort of level of relief. China has only restructured, to the best of my knowledge, debts of countries which were already defaulting, like Ethiopia, for instance. I think I don't know if they've done Zambia. So the China issue is a black box. I really cannot tell you what goes on in that black box. I doubt whether anybody else can. But the G20 countries, we're really trying to put pressure on China to also do this. But China is also in trouble because it overextended itself.
All right.
With all this BRI and this huge foray into loans which have all gone bad. So it's a difficult situation. The big one for us is the bond markets. And again, there was an appeal trying to get the commercial lenders also to take part in these sort of restructurings. They have resisted very heavily. So that situation is also quite fluid. So I think what really the default situation is that the government will try its best to meet the IMF conditions, get an IMF bailout, and then shift back to borrowing heavily from, already we have that. I mean, this year we've borrowed very heavily in the last year and a half from the World Bank.
Right.
Go back to borrowing as much cheap money and long-term money from the World Bank, AFDB, and the IMF as possible. Now, one of the drawbacks of that kind of money, of course, it comes with a lot of very tough conditions. And then the other thing is that it is not amenable to relief and to debt restructuring. It is the last to get debt restructuring, even if you look at the thing which was called HIPIC. By the time they got to restructuring World Bank IMF debt, that's really way down the road.
All these things we are talking about, Dr. Ari, are mostly about fiscal policy. What about Kenya's monetary policy? We hear about the Federal Reserve. From where you sit, does the Central Bank of Kenya do enough to make sure that we get out of the situation we are in right now?
The central bank is irrelevant. In countries like these, we have something called fiscal dominance. Fiscal dominance means that probably 90% of the securities out there are government securities.
Right.
Yeah, so most of the debt sort of out there is government debt. Is the one who's creating these financial instruments. If you go to the US, it's the other way around. 70% of the bonds out there are commercial, they are private sector bonds. So when you hear that the Fed is doing quantitative easing, they are doing unconventional bond buying, but they're actually buying private sector securities. We do not have private sector securities out there that the central bank can buy. Right. To sort of put liquidity in the market, only government paper. So by and large, the central bank is really just a banker to the government. It doesn't have any sort of levers of its own that can have any significant impact.
All right, now in 2019, the Kenyan Senate voted to raise the debt ceiling to 9 trillion shillings, abandoning, in effect, the World Bank recommended 50% of GDP. And we seem to be maxing that out in the next 2 years or so, if reports are to be believed. And now, again, the government wants that ceiling raised to 12 trillion. Should we do it?
Those are really superfluous things. Depending on what happens macro-wise and the whatever of your debt and movement of macro prices, your shilling can depreciate by 20% and your debt ratio jumps about by 10%. So that debt ratio doesn't just go up because you're borrowing. It's driven by other factors. Exchange rate movements is one of the factors. And so you're not fully in control of what it is. And if the government is in distress, that ceiling is not going to stop the government from borrowing, because as you see, you just go back to parliament and change it. So that is really not an effective agency of restraint, right, in a meaningful way. The only thing that can control government's sort of appetite for borrowing is discipline. It is not law. It is not other sort of external agencies or levers. It's just discipline. It's a political decision. But these are political decisions on resource allocation, and that's the only thing that can change it.
Very quickly, tell us in very lay terms, Kenya's elevated debt repayments, 69.2% of GDP. What do that? Kenya's elevated, they're very high repayments, debt repayments. We're talking about 7.1 trillion. That's, I understand, is 69.2% of GDP. In very lay terms, what does this mean for this country's fiscal future?
70% of GDP is not the debt repayment. It is the debt expressed as a percentage of 1 year's GDP.
Right.
Debt repayment is what I have said. This year, debt is quite, public debt is quite complicated. But the first thing you pay on all your debt is interest. Okay?
Yeah.
This year, interest payment is 450 billion shillings. Okay? So interest payment is now as high as the national government wage bill. It's actually about to overtake it. Now, I said of that interest, 3/4 is on domestic debt, about 300 billion plus. Is the treasury bills held by banks and bonds held by banks and pension funds and other Kenyans. So that the savings of Kenyans. Okay? So the biggest challenge when you're talking about our debt is actually domestic, not foreign. Then the other debt which you pay, when it comes to, there's a difference between market debt, of which domestic is market debt, and bank debt. Like, so market debt is bonds, domestic or foreign. Those ones, when they come up for maturity, you roll over. But you hope you can roll of it over, but there is refinancing risk that you might not be able to, particularly for foreign ones. But bank debt, you also pay principal, like Chinese debt. So in total, if you exclude the rollovers, or what you call refinancing, interest plus principal that you're paying on bank debt this year is in the order of 650 billion shillings.
Right.
Now, 650 billion shillings is about half of your revenue this year. So although you're saying that 69% of debt, in fact, half of your tax revenue is going to finance debt. To debt repayment. That's the critical number, because that comes out of your revenue, of your taxes. It also means that it leaves, doesn't leave enough money to finance other things. That's why your doctors can go on strike, but you can't pay them, because you actually do not have money. So you're juggling between, that's why you find government building a lot of arrears with suppliers.
All right.
And that's why you find there is no money to maintain government vehicles, to buy fuel for the police. You start running out of medicine in hospitals. That's what it means when you're in debt distress, because all your money is going to service debt. So there isn't enough money for 1M. And of course, if you're borrowing for recurrent, it is crowding out what you would then have been able to put into development budget. Although at this point in time, I think we should suspend most development budget projects. That's the ones which have put them as in trouble in the first place.
All right.
And it also means that if you're borrowing, if you're in debt distress, and you are forced to be financing this domestically, it means that you continue crowding out the private sector, and therefore your private economy continues to be weak, and therefore undermines your revenue base. So it's not a good situation to be in. There is no simple solution to it. As I've said over the years, this is a thing which you do prevention. By the time it has hit you, it's probably too late. You're just going to have to to live with the consequences.
All right, my final question to you, Dr. This thing of government's insatiable appetite for borrowing has become a kind of a cliche. Do you see this government being able to tame its appetite for borrowing, for expenditure, or is time up for President Uhuru Kenyatta?
It is up because he is no longer borrowing by decision, by sort of like proactively making a decision to borrow. The government is now what you're doing distress borrowing, which you see also in businesses which are failing. You see a business which is failing and is just borrowing to keep itself afloat. As you're trying to negotiate with creditors. Who you're going to pay today, who you're going to pay tomorrow, who can wait, what expenditures are non-essential. So they are no longer doing it as per a plan. And as I said, they are just about to go into an IMF bailout. It is not a choice. I recall I had the president when he was launching a building, I think being built by the county as some tower, sort of making noise or sort of complaining about external people infringing on our sovereignty. I knew he was talking about the IMF, and he reminded me exactly of Moi. He has ended up exactly where his political mentor ended. That's exactly how Moi ended up in the early 90s. That's where Uhuru Kenyatta is. So it is no longer a choice situation. The other thing is that once you get into an IMF program, economies take quite a while to turn around. And it's usually pain before gain. So for the time that Uhuru Kenyatta is left in office, it's going to be all pain, and he's not going to benefit. To benefit from the recovery if it happens, because it cannot happen within his time. So I suspect that even that bailout he is going into with the IMF, because it's going to be politically very costly, is also going to be quite tumultuous. So I expect some of the to see a replay of some of the things that we were having between Moi and the IMF and the World Bank in the early 90s. That's how I see him ending his term.
All right. Thank you, Dr. for talking to us tonight.
Thank you. Bye.
Dr. David Ndii, Economist, talking to us about the debt situation in the country. It is a conversation we will continue to dissect for you. Is Kenya broke? What is going to happen? What is going to be happening in the coming months? I shall leave it on KTN Prime this Tuesday night. Here on KTN News, for all of us here on the broadcast, we do appreciate the privilege of your time tonight. Thank you for watching. Our sign language interpreter tonight was Damian Evans. I am Ben Kitili. Good night from Nairobi.